Hi, it's Nick Sanger again with the Literary Compass Book Talk. Please be sure to check out our blog at literarycompass.blogspot.com. Well, today is the third in a series of 3 book talks about Lenten books to help us with the acts of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. We've already talked about prayer with The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, and we talked about almsgiving with 2 books by Mother Teresa. And today we're going to be talking about fasting. Now, there aren't very many books out that deal with the subject of fasting. I don't think that publishers are anxious to look for books on fasting to hit the bestseller list. But I do have one book that mentions fasting in this one particular section I'm going to read to you, and it also mentions fasting in other contexts throughout the rest of its chapters. The book is called Divine Intimacy. And really, it is a daily meditation guide for every day of the church year, and it is fantastic. I used this once for an entire year, and it was the subject of my meditation for that year, and it is very, very well done. It's written by Father Gabriel of St. Mary Magdalene, and it goes by the old church calendar, the calendar before the changes of Vatican II, so it is a bit difficult to decide which meditation goes with which day. But it wasn't too difficult. I was able to find a website that kind of converted the previous church calendar to the new church calendar, and I was able to follow along okay. But the meditations in here are absolutely brilliant. They're very, very helpful for a person on their spiritual journey. At least I found them helpful. So let me share with you what he has to say about fasting. Now, the word that people used to use for this, which kind of has a bad connotation these days, is mortification. So when you hear that word mortification, just think of fasting. He says, as a result of original sin, man no longer has complete dominion over his senses and his flesh. Therefore, he's filled with evil tendencies which try to push him toward what is base. St. Paul humbly admits, I know that there dwelleth not in me, that is to say, in my flesh, that which is good. For the good which I will, I do not. But the evil which I will not, that I do. God certainly gives us the grace to overcome our evil tendencies, but we must also use our own efforts, which consist in voluntary mortification. They that are Christ's have crucified their flesh with the vices and concupiscences. That's from Galatians. The purpose of corporal mortification is not to inflict pain and privation on the body for the pleasure of making it suffer, but to discipline and control all its tendencies, which are contrary to the life of grace. The Apostle warns us, if you live according to the flesh, you shall die. But if you live by the Spirit, you mortify the deeds of the flesh, you shall live. That's from Romans. We must curb ourselves in order to avoid falls. We must prune the useless or harmful branches in order to avoid deviation. We must direct toward good the forces which, left to themselves, might lead us into sin. For these reasons, mortification, although it is not an end in itself, nor the principal element in the Christian life, occupies a fundamental place in it and is an absolutely indispensable means toward attaining a spiritual life. No one can escape this law without closing off all access to eternal salvation, to sanctity. St. Paul, who had done and suffered much for Christ, did not consider himself dispensed from it, and said, I chastise my body and bring it into subjection, lest perhaps, when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway. That's from 1 Corinthians. St. Teresa warns us that if prayer is to be genuine, it must be reinforced with this practice of mortification, for prayer and self-indulgence do not go together. It would be an illusion to think that we can reach intimacy with God without the serious exercise of physical mortification. In this regard, we must take care that love of our own body and of our physical welfare does not cause us to reject all our penitential practices under the pretext that they will ruin our health. In reality, there are many corporal mortifications which, without the slightest danger to our health, have the great advantage of keeping our spirit of generosity on the alert by the voluntary acceptance of a little physical suffering. If we are to be generous in this respect, we must rid ourselves of all inordinate love for our body, that is, of all excessive preoccupation about our health. And we must put aside all anxiety about food, clothing, rest, and comfort. This body of ours, says St. Teresa, has one fault. The more you indulge it, the more things it discovers to be essential to it. And if there is any reasonable pretext for indulgence, however little necessity for it there may be, the poor soul is deceived and prevented from making progress. Anyone who wants to advance on the road to sanctity and union with God must be ready to sacrifice everything, even in the physical order, to the point of giving up the skin and everything else for Christ, as St. John of the Cross says. He teaches, however, that in these matters we must always depend on our superiors or confessors. Corporal penance without obedience is no more than the penance of beasts, because it prefers a material practice to obedience, which is penance of the reason and discretion, and is therefore the sacrifice most pleasing to God. So we need to do our fasting under the supervision of a superior, someone who is watching out for us. And so, we don't sacrifice and we don't fast to cause physical suffering, but we sacrifice to break off the bonds of our slavery to this material world. So, I hope that helps you as you think about fasting for Lent, and that brings to a close this 3-part series on fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, and I hope to see you next time on this Literary Compass Book Talk. Thank you, and have a wonderful Lent.